He was 21 years old when he first climbed into a tank. He was 30 years old when he died in one. In between those 9 years, he became the most decorated and most feared tank commander in the entire Second World War. Not just in the SS, not just in the German army, in the entire war on every side. He destroyed over 138 tanks, over 132 anti-tank guns, hundreds of other armored vehicles and trucks and personnel carriers. He did all of this from the cramped interior of a single tank, commanding a crew of 5 men on battlefields stretching from the Soviet Union to the Norman countryside of France. His name was Michael Wittmann, and on a quiet street in a small Norman town on a June morning in 1944, he did something so extraordinary that military historians are still arguing about it 80 years later. This is his complete story. Every battle, every decoration, every controversy, and the full honest truth about the man behind the legend. Michael Wittmann was born on April 22, 1914, in Vogeltal, a tiny farming village in the Oberpfalz region of Bavaria in southern Germany. The village was so small that most Germans had never heard of it, and most maps did not show it. His father was a farmer. His mother raised 5 children, of whom Michael was the second. The family was Catholic, conservative, and rooted in the land in the way that Bavarian farming families had been for generations. They were not wealthy. They were not connected. They were ordinary working people in a small place who lived ordinary working lives. There was nothing in that childhood, nothing in that village, nothing in those fields and forests of rural Bavaria that suggested the boy growing up there would one day be the most famous tank commander in history. He finished his schooling and worked on the family farm as a young man. In 1934, at the age of 20, he did what many young German men of his generation did. He volunteered for military service. He served his mandatory period in the Reichswehr, the professional German army, and was discharged in 1936. But military life had done something to him. It had given him a sense of purpose and structure and belonging that farm life in Vogeltal could not match. He did not go back to the fields. Instead, in 1936, he volunteered again, this time for the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Hitler's personal bodyguard regiment, the most prestigious formation in the entire SS. He was accepted. He was 22 years old, and his entire life changed direction completely in that moment. He began his SS career as an infantryman, not as a tanker, not as the legendary figure he would eventually become. Just a young Bavarian soldier learning the basics of military life within the demanding environment of the Leibstandarte. The Leibstandarte had extremely high standards for its recruits, physical standards, ideological standards, standards of discipline and bearing that were more demanding than almost anywhere else in the German military. Wittmann met all of them. He was physically imposing, naturally disciplined, and possessed of a quality that his instructors noticed immediately. He was a natural soldier, not in the sense of someone who enjoyed violence, but in the deeper sense of someone who understood instinctively how tactical situations worked, who could read ground and understand threats and opportunities faster than the men around him. He served in the Leibstandarte through the political operations of the late 1930s that were not yet real combat, but were the formative experiences of a generation of SS soldiers. The annexation of Austria in March 1938, when German forces crossed the border and were greeted by cheering crowds in Vienna. The occupation of the Sudetenland later that year, when the western regions of Czechoslovakia were absorbed into the Reich following the Munich Agreement. The occupation of the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, when German forces completed the destruction of that state. Wittmann was part of all of these operations. He was absorbing the culture and the ideology and the methods of the SS in its formative period. He was becoming, in every sense, an SS man. And then in September 1939, the real war began. Germany invaded Poland. Wittmann fought in Poland as an armored car commander, his first experience of actual combat. He was 25 years old, and he discovered something important about himself in the fighting in Poland. He was not afraid. This is a more remarkable statement than it sounds. Many brave men are afraid in combat and fight through the fear. Wittmann seemed genuinely unbothered by personal danger in a way that was unusual even among the combat veterans of the Leibstandarte. He moved toward danger rather than away from it. He made decisions faster than the situation seemed to require, and his decisions were consistently correct. Poland was crushed in 5 weeks, and Wittmann came out of it decorated and noticed. France in May 1940, again in armored cars, again performing with distinction, again accumulating experience and recognition. The campaign in France was a revelation in terms of what mobile armored warfare could achieve. Germany destroyed the French army and ejected the British from the continent in 6 weeks, achieving what 4 years of grinding trench warfare in the First World War had failed to accomplish. The lesson that mobile armored forces, properly commanded and aggressively employed, could achieve results that seemed impossible to more cautious minds, was a lesson that Wittmann absorbed completely. It shaped everything he would do afterward. After France, he was transferred to tanks, first to the Panzer III, the standard German medium tank of the early war period. He trained, he qualified, he demonstrated immediately that his instincts translated perfectly from armored cars to tanks. And then he was introduced to the vehicle that would make him immortal, the Tiger one, the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger Ausf. E, 60 tons of steel and engineering, a hull and turret of face-hardened armor plate that was impervious to most Allied anti-tank weapons at combat ranges. And at its heart, the weapon that made the Tiger genuinely terrifying. The 88mm KWK 36 gun, derived from the famous Flak 88 anti-aircraft gun that had proven devastating against tanks in North Africa, the Tiger's 88 could punch through the armor of any Allied tank in the war at ranges where those tanks could not effectively return fire. The Tiger was slow, it was mechanically complex and prone to breakdown. It consumed fuel at a rate that made logistics a constant nightmare. But when it was working and when it was in the right hands, it was the most dangerous tank on any battlefield in the world. And Michael Wittmann had exactly the right hands. His first combat in a Tiger came on the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa had begun in June 1941, and the Leibstandarte had been part of the massive German drive into the Soviet Union from the opening days. By the time Wittmann transitioned to Tigers, the war in the East had already consumed millions of lives and transformed itself from the quick campaign that German planners had envisioned into a grinding war of attrition that was steadily turning against Germany. The Soviet Union had not collapsed. It had absorbed losses that would have destroyed any other nation and kept fighting. And it was producing tanks, enormous numbers of tanks. The T-34 in particular was a shock to German tank crews who had expected technical superiority across the board and instead found an opponent that was in many respects their equal, and in terms of numbers, their overwhelming superior. To survive as a tank commander on the Eastern Front in 1942 and 1943 required genuine skill. To thrive there required something beyond skill. It required the kind of tactical instinct that cannot be taught, that some men simply have, and most do not. Wittmann had it. He began accumulating kills at a rate that drew attention even among the highly competitive world of German tank aces. His method was consistent and distinctive. He used the superior range of his 88mm gun to engage Soviet tanks before they could effectively return fire. He maneuvered aggressively to find firing positions that maximize this range advantage. He read the ground with extraordinary speed, identifying defensible positions and approach routes faster than his opponents could respond. And he attacked, always attacked. Even in defensive situations, he looked for ways to go forward, to seize the initiative, to make the enemy react to him rather than the other way around. The battles of 1943 were the crucible in which Wittmann's legend was forged on the Eastern Front. At Kharkov in February and March 1943, he fought in the SS counterattack that recaptured the city from Soviet forces and temporarily stabilized the southern sector of the front. The fighting around Kharkov was brutal urban and suburban combat in winter conditions against Soviet forces that were riding the momentum of their great victory at Stalingrad. The SS divisions, including the Leibstandarte, fought with exceptional aggression and tactical skill. Wittmann's Tiger was in the center of the fighting. His kill count rose dramatically. Then Kursk in July 1943. The greatest tank battle in history. Over 6,000 tanks engaged on both sides across the vast rolling terrain of the Kursk salient. Germany threw everything it had into the offensive, including its newest and most powerful armored vehicles, the Tiger, the Panther, and the Ferdinand tank destroyer. The Soviet Union had spent months preparing the most elaborate defensive system in military history, with multiple belts of anti-tank guns, minefields, and prepared defensive positions stretching dozens of kilometers in depth. The German offensive failed to break through. The losses on both sides were catastrophic. And after Kursk, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed permanently to the Soviet Union. Germany would never again mount a major strategic offensive in the East. But within the catastrophe of Kursk, Wittmann's individual performance was extraordinary. His Tiger destroyed tank after tank as the SS Panzer Corps ground its way into the Soviet defensive belts. His total kill count during the Kursk offensive was remarkable, even by his own standards. And then came the engagement that changed everything. On January 13th, 1944, near the town of Tainte, in the area of the Cherkasy Pocket on the Eastern Front, Wittmann's Tiger engaged Soviet armored forces in a series of encounters that produced his most spectacular single-day performance of the entire war. In engagements lasting through the day, his Tiger destroyed an extraordinary number of Soviet tanks and vehicles. The exact numbers credited to him in German records have been questioned by historians who note that wartime kill claims were often inflated and difficult to verify. But the engagements were real, the destruction was real, and the performance was genuinely exceptional, even allowing for the inevitable uncertainties of wartime record-keeping. The Knight's Cross followed immediately. He was summoned to Hitler's headquarters. He stood before the Führer in person. Hitler pinned the decoration to his uniform and shook his hand. Goebbels' propaganda apparatus went into overdrive. Michael Wittmann, the farmer's son from Vogeltal, who had become Germany's greatest tank ace, was exactly the story that a regime running out of good stories desperately needed. Young, modest, handsome in a clean-cut Bavarian way, genuinely heroic in the narrow military sense. His photograph appeared on the front pages of newspapers across Germany. His story was broadcast on the radio. He was held up as proof that individual German greatness could still overcome the overwhelming material superiority of Germany's enemies. The oak leaves to his knight's cross followed. Then the swords. He became one of the most decorated soldiers in the German armed forces. He was promoted. He was given command. And in the spring of 1944, he was sent to France with the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, equipped with Tigers, positioned to play a central role in defeating the Allied invasion that everyone knew was coming. The invasion came on June 6, 1944. D-Day. The greatest amphibious operation in history. Over 150,000 Allied soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy in a single day. The German defensive system, despite years of preparation and despite the Atlantic Wall that Hitler had proclaimed impregnable, failed to throw the Allies back into the sea. The beachhead was established, and the brutal fighting for Normandy began. The 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion was moving toward the front in the days following D-Day, its Tigers grinding slowly through the narrow lanes of the Normandy and Villers-Bocage. Allied air power was omnipresent and lethal. Every movement in daylight risked attack from Hawker Typhoon fighter bombers that had proven devastatingly effective against German armor. Movement was slow and dangerous, but the Tigers were moving. On June 13, 1944, 1 week after D-Day, near the small town of Villers-Bocage, Michael Wittmann did something that military historians have analyzed and argued about ever since. The British 7th Armored Division, the legendary Desert Rats, the men who had pursued Rommel across North Africa and fought in the desert from El Alamein to Tunisia, were advancing along the main road through Villers-Bocage as part of an attempt to outflank the German position around Caen. It was a bold move. If it succeeded, it could unravel the entire German defensive line in Normandy. The column moving along the road was substantial. Cromwell tanks of the 4th County of London Yeomanry, half-tracks carrying infantry of the 1st Rifle Brigade, personnel carriers, scout cars, support vehicles, a long, vulnerable column moving along a road with its flanks in the Bocage. Wittmann was nearby with a small number of Tigers. He observed the column. He saw its length, its apparent unawareness of his presence, its vulnerability. He made a decision. He drove his Tiger onto the road and attacked. What followed in the next 15 to 20 minutes became the most famous single-tank action of the entire Second World War. Wittmann drove along the length of the British column, firing his 88mm gun. The Cromwell tanks that the 7th Armored Division was equipped with could not penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor at the ranges involved. Their guns were essentially useless against what was coming at them. Vehicle after vehicle was hit and destroyed. Tanks brewed up, their ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. Half-tracks were destroyed with their infantry inside. Personnel carriers burned. The column disintegrated into chaos. Men abandoned their vehicles and ran for the cover of the Bocage hedgerows on both sides of the road. In approximately 15 minutes of fighting, Wittmann's single Tiger destroyed an estimated 14 tanks, 15 personnel carriers, and numerous other vehicles, and inflicted casualties that threw the entire 7th Armored Division's advance into confusion. He then drove into the town of Villers-Bocage itself, where British tanks were positioned in the streets. The fighting in the confined urban environment was chaotic and dangerous in ways that open country fighting was not. In the town streets, the Tiger's range advantage was neutralized. British tanks and infantry with PIAT anti-tank weapons could engage at close range. Wittmann's Tiger was hit multiple times and eventually immobilized. He and his crew abandoned the vehicle and made their way back to German lines on foot through the Bocage. The Tiger was lost, but the battle was won. The 7th Armored Division's advance was stopped. The British were forced to pull back from Villers-Bocage. The threat to the German flank was eliminated, and Michael Wittmann's 15 minutes of extraordinary aggression had changed the course of the battle for Normandy, at least temporarily, at least in that sector. The propaganda value was incalculable. Goebbels could not have scripted it better. Germany's greatest tank ace, already a household name, had driven a single tank into a British division and stopped it cold. The story was broadcast across Germany. It was presented as proof that German fighting spirit and individual genius could still overcome Allied material superiority. Wittmann received the highest grade of the Knight's Cross, the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds. He was one of only 27 men in the entire war to receive this decoration. He was a national hero in a nation that was running desperately short of heroes. But historians have complicated the story in the decades since. Not the core facts, which are well documented and not seriously disputed, but the interpretation and the context. Some historians have pointed out that Wittmann's attack, while tactically brilliant in its immediate effect, was also strategically questionable. By charging into the British column alone, rather than waiting for the rest of his battalion to coordinate a more comprehensive attack, he may have actually let the 7th Armored Division off more lightly than a properly coordinated assault might have. Other historians have defended his decision as exactly correct, given the time-sensitive opportunity that presented itself. The debate continues. What is not debated is the broader context. The 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion that Wittmann commanded was part of the Waffen-SS. The Waffen-SS in Normandy was simultaneously fighting a military campaign and committing war crimes. 4 days before Villers-Bocage, on June 9th and 10th, the SS division Das Reich had massacred 642 men, women, and children in the French village of Oradour-sur-Glane. On June 7th, the day after D-Day, soldiers of the Leibstandarte had murdered Canadian prisoners of war at the Abbaye d'Ardenne. These were the units Wittmann served alongside. This was the organization that celebrated him and made him famous. His legend was a propaganda tool of a genocidal regime. And that context is inseparable from the story, however brilliant the individual military achievement. Wittmann was offered a safe posting after Villers-Bocage. His superiors recognized that he had become so valuable as a propaganda figure that his death would be a significant blow to German morale. He was offered a training command that would have kept him away from the fighting. He refused. He went back to his Tiger. He went back to the front. His reasons for refusing the safe option are not recorded in any surviving document. We can speculate. genuine commitment to his men. The inability of a man entirely defined by combat to imagine himself in any other role. Personal courage that made the safe option feel like cowardice. Probably all of these things simultaneously. He fought through July 1944 as the Allied breakout from Normandy built momentum. German forces were under relentless pressure. Allied material superiority was overwhelming. Allied air power made every movement a gamble with death. The Tigers of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion were fighting constantly, taking losses, being repaired and sent back, taking more losses. The attrition was unsustainable. Germany was losing Normandy, and everyone who could read a map knew it. August 8th, 1944, Operation Totalize, the massive Allied offensive aimed at breaking through the German lines south of Caen and driving toward Falaise. Canadian and Polish forces, supported by enormous air and artillery preparation, crashed into the German defensive line. The 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion was committed to the defense. Wittmann's Tiger was in action near the village of Sinto. And there, on that Norman road, on that August morning, Michael Wittmann died. He was 30 years old. The exact circumstances of his death became one of the most debated questions in the study of tank warfare. Multiple Allied units claimed credit for destroying his Tiger. For decades, the most popular version credited a rocket from a RAF Typhoon aircraft. Later research shifted the consensus toward Canadian Sherman Firefly tanks of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment. The Firefly was a Sherman tank fitted with the British 17-pounder gun, a high-velocity weapon capable of penetrating Tiger armor at combat ranges, one of the few Allied weapons that could reliably defeat the Tiger in a fair fight. The most detailed recent historical analysis supports the Firefly theory, but the debate is not entirely settled and probably never will be. His body was not immediately recovered. In the chaos of the fighting around Sinto, the precise location of the destroyed Tiger and its crew was not documented. For nearly 4 decades after the war, Wittmann's remains were simply missing. And then in 1983, road construction near Sinto uncovered human remains that were subsequently identified as Wittmann and members of his crew. They were reburied at the German military cemetery at La Combe in Normandy, where he rests today in the same Norman soil where he died, surrounded by thousands of other German soldiers who fell in the fighting for France. The grave at La Combe has become a place of pilgrimage for military history enthusiasts, particularly those interested in tank warfare. People travel from across the world to stand at his grave. Flowers are left. Photographs are taken. The legend lives on in a way that few Second World War figures outside the very highest levels of command can match. And this is where we need to be completely honest about what that legend means and what it does not mean. Michael Wittmann was a genuinely exceptional tank commander. The tactical skill he demonstrated across years of combat on 2 fronts was real. The courage was real. The achievement at Villers-Bocage was real. These things are true, and they deserve to be acknowledged because honest history requires acknowledging reality, even when it is complicated. But Michael Wittmann was an SS officer. He wore the SS runes on his collar. He served the SS and was celebrated by the SS propaganda machine for the purposes of the SS and the Nazi regime it served. The organization that made him famous was the organization that ran the concentration camps, that commanded the Einsatzgruppen that murdered over 1 million Jewish civilians in the Soviet Union. that massacred the population of Oradour-sur-Glane, that murdered Canadian prisoners of war 4 days before his greatest battle. You cannot take Michael Wittmann the tank ace and separate him from Michael Wittmann the SS officer. Both exist in the same man. Both are part of the same story. He was 30 years old when he died in a burning Tiger on a Norman road. He had spent more than a third of his short life in tanks and armored vehicles, fighting wars that Germany started and could not win. He was extraordinarily good at what he did, and what he did was in service of one of the most criminal regimes in human history. The talent and the context, the courage and the institution, the legend and the truth, all of it together. That is the complete picture of Michael Wittmann. And anything less than the complete picture is not history. It is myth, and the dead deserve better than myth.